going to be a discussion on the book. So I have this privilege on behalf of Lama Khan to talk a little bit about the book and then followed by the author and also the discussant. If you look at the Bibi's room, it examines the neglected and marginalized terrain of Hyderabadi women's prose in Urdu, and it brings English language audiences the lives and works of three authors, particularly Zinat Sajida, Najma Nikhat and Jilani Banu. The first two have never been translated or discussed in English before. The book offers representative translations, biographies, and also critical analysis of the work of all three writers, as well as the material background of the political, social, and literary conditions in the 20th century Hyderabad, against which their work is framed. So the translation consists of two short stories and one literary essay, which is significant because non-fiction is generally neglected and women's humorous writings are particularly ignored. So the picture of Hyderabadi women's life that emerges generate the new knowledge about the condition in which women live, write and resist, and also expands our understanding of their public participation in South Asia. A quick word about the author. Nazia Akhtar is an assistant professor in the Human Sciences Research Group at the International Institute of Information Technology, popularly known as IIIT Hyderabad, where she teaches courses in Indian and Russian literature. And in 2017, she was awarded a New India Foundation Fellowship to write a book on Urdu prose by Hyderabadi women. Bibi's Room, Hyderabadi Women and 20th Century Urdu Prose went into print in July 2022, just 2 months back. And Nazia has recently received a commendation from the jury of the Jawad Memorial Prize 2021 for her translation of Zinat Sajida's Urdu short story Chottam Jaan. She is currently translating more Urdu writings of Hyderabadi women and conducting research on literary representations of the transfer of power as it affected Hyderabad. So please join me in welcoming Nazia Akhtar. I also have the privilege to introduce the discussant. Purnima Tammireddy is a fiction writer, translator, book reviewer, and columnist, and primarily writing in Telugu. She co-founded Pustakam.net, a website for book reviews, and was part of it for 14 long years. And Manto in Telugu is a digital project to bring the writer closer to Telugu readers. And in 2022, she has co-founded Ilami Publications and...
Thank you, Naeem. Thank you, Lama Khan and Hyderabad Urban Lab for organizing this. Thank you, Nazia, for being here and for writing such a wonderful book. And all of you on a rainy evening, on a Saturday, coming here and joining us. It's delightful experience. Thank you, one and all. Before we start the question and answer conversation part, I would like to say how precious is this book for any Hyderabadi, for any literature lover. Usually you get translation works of anthologies, short stories or essays or some critical essays, but this book is so beautifully designed and shaped that it has all things, and in some sense at the end of the book, when you read all of the authors, you feel like you have gone to them and hugged them. That's the kind of personal feeling you get. So I can't stop gushing about this book, but yeah, it is precious in so many ways. For me as a Hyderabadi, as a short fiction writer, as a literature lover. So thanks again and again, Nazia, for bringing out this book, putting out so much effort into it. And if we could applaud Nazia for this once more, that would be great. So yeah, for me, any woman's writing that I tend to understand is through the gender perspective, which you also bring in a lot here. For me, Zoan Roas, How to Suppress Women's Writing, is a very important book for me to make me understand how to look at women's writing and also my writing as a woman. So she says it is very important for us to bring the earlier generation's work into the current generation so that we can understand how the earlier women have written, and also that the sacred word of greatest women writer, that to give that sense of feeling. So I would like to begin the conversation saying that this could have been any one author's book, writer's book, or it could have been a bunch of short story collection. But instead you have carefully crafted this, and apart from the three eminent writers that you have chosen, you also have put the soul and heart of bygone era Hyderabad into this. So can you walk us through why did you feel like shaping this book the way you did?
Okay, so I think your question is why does it have biography, translation, all these three things,
yes,
right? Okay. So yes, you're right. I mean, I could have written a book that was just a biography of one of these authors, or published books of translations, which actually I'm going to be doing. So the next two books are going to be translations of more of Zinat Sajida's work, as well as a novel that Jilani Bano has produced, and which I talk about in this book. So now I'm going to translate that. But I think this book for me was, there are two ways of writing. Writers always talk about, books where you plan everything out like a blueprint, and you take a lot of time in planning that and then writing it. And then you know exactly what's going to be in it. And then there are other writers who are called pantsers, because we are flying by the seat of our pants. And you discover the book as you write it. So for me, this was about that, because when I began doing this work, there was no discourse of Hyderabadi women's writing, except for two people whom I must acknowledge, who've done this work, very urgent work in Urdu. Right, so there's Amina Tahseen, of course, Professor Amina Tahseen, who works at Manu, who's written a very comprehensive book about Hyderabadi women's writings in Urdu. It's called Hyderabad Mein Urdu Ka Nisai Adab. And before, about 50 years before her, 50, 60 years before her, there was a man called Nasiruddin Hashmi, who made the effort to produce several books documenting the many, women poets. He documented a list of 150 women poets from the Deccan, for example. He wrote extensively about, women social workers, women writers of prose, and so on. But, it was still a discovery, because there was no concept that there was any such thing as Hyderabadi women's writings in Urdu, or Hyderabadi, I should be more specific, Hyderabadi women's prose. In Urdu, and this was new for me. Urdu was new for me. I taught myself how to read Urdu about 5 or 6 years ago, and I remember you and I were talking about that just last night, right?
Yeah.
I mean, teaching yourselves how to kind of, a new script.
Yes.
So the book was as much me learning the terrain of this, and so it just made sense to not only talk about, to not only translate a writer, to not only go into their biography or their life, but also analyze the texts to get a sense of the possibilities and the scopes of reading this text, the range of reading. And why do we do literary analysis, right? We do literary analysis precisely for that reason, to understand what are the different meanings that a text could have had at that point when the writer wrote it, and does it have any valence for us today? Can we read it today? What does it mean for us today? So there are writings that read really well and which are very relevant to us even today. If you look at Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote, If Allah Were a Woman, by Zinat Sajida, there are so many things in that which are relevant to discussions and debates about God, prophet and believer, about gender, about patriarchy, about even the feminine I, right, the first person voice, which resonates with us today, right? So, what are the implications of such writing? What are the, how do we understand it in the world in which, these women wrote, and in the world in which we write today? So I think for those reasons, this being, the first book on this subject, my first book, my first time with Urdu, I had to kind of go through this long journey and take everyone with me. So I hope it's worked.
Yeah, that is beautiful. And also, as I said, I can't stop gushing about this book. So as I recollect, I'll keep saying. One other beautiful point about this book is it is a scholarly work. At places it is dense in the sense that when it is trying to explain some complex things. But again, the prose is so lucid and so accessible that even a common literature lover can pick it up and enjoy it from page 1 to the end. So again, kudos on that as well, because you brought that point. And in more sense, it reminded me Rakshinda Jalil's ma'am's work also, because she also makes the accessibility part very integral to her work. So yeah, one question, the next question I would like to ask is, while picking these authors, did you choose, how did you choose them, or were there concerns about this writing not standing up to the mark of current generation writings, or will people be feeling this is as too ancient or too outdated? Did you have any such concerns in picking and choosing the writers, or how did you arrive at these three writers? Whichever way you want to answer.
Purnima, I'm so glad that you mentioned Rakshinda Jalil, because one thing that I forgot to mention earlier is this book was also consciously developed along the lines of Rakshinda Jalil's book on Rashid Jahan, A Rebel with a Cause. This was, so this was also, because she does precisely that, because we can't just understand Rashid Jahan in a vacuum. You need to have the whole background of her life and all of that. So she does this combination of biography, translation and literary analysis. So I was consciously following that, and this book is inspired by that. As far as the choice of the writers is concerned, I think there were several reasons. I mean, one reason is totally, entirely personal and subjective, which is that I really like these three writers.
Okay.
So I wanted to work on them. The second thing is that the range of themes, forms, ideas, the variety of writing, and at the same time, a convergence on which I can weave all three of them into one book, was possible with these three writers. I mean, earlier I had also planned to include Wajida Tabassum, but for reasons which I outline in the book, I wasn't able to go into her. I wasn't able to include a fourth chapter on her. But yeah, so these three writers, what I really liked about Zeenat Sajida is, of course, I mean, she's absolutely irresistible. It's a no-brainer to have her in this, and to have this essay of hers in this. Literally, I think both publishing and translation have neglected non-fiction. There is this, cultural capital that is associated with poetry, with the novel, with even the short story. The cultural capital of ghazal poetry is easy to understand. It is centuries old. It's older than a millennium. But there's a cultural capital that's associated with the novel and the short story, which I also connect to. The colonial period, right, and the development of these forms then. So both the novel and the short story owe a lot to, in Urdu and in many Indian languages. Of course, comes out of the context of Indian literary forms, but also owes a lot to the European novel and the European short story, the modernist short story in particular. So somewhere in this hierarchy, somewhere in the political and cultural capital of fiction, of these prominent fiction forms like the novel or the short story, or ghazal poetry, which is so elevated, and we frequently associate, we think that Urdu poetry is synonymous with the ghazal. So in that, I think there's a very long and rich tradition of non-fiction prose in Urdu, at least, that I can speak of. I mean, in the Hyderabad context, you have people writing travelogues. Sohra Humayun Mirza, for instance, was writing travelogues in the 1920s. And it's been going on for much longer than that, from the beginning of journalism and print, in the 1870s. So it's totally neglected. I mean, people have made statements that women writers have only in the past 20 years begun to write humor in Urdu, Hyderabadi women writers, and this is not true. We know that. So, I mean, it was obvious that I would, have Zinat Sajida for that reason. Najma Akhtar, Deodi stories are just so beautiful, and I thought, a writer with a small oeuvre, a writer who only wrote some 26 or 30 short stories in her life, is one of the reasons that absolutely made me insist on keeping her in this book. Is someone once told me, oh, she was a minor writer. So I was like, how do you decide questions of minority and majority? How do you decide what the canon is? Who is a major writer? Who is a minor writer? And frequently I find that these constructs of canon, of majority, of minority are shaped to the detriment and exclusion of an accounting of gendered lives, right? The conditions in which women live and write are frequently very different. So you cannot use the same yardstick. You can't talk about, ideas of quality have not fallen from the sky. They are historically constituted. So, so to me, that was one reason, because one, I liked Najma Akhtar's stories and I could see the potential that she had if she had had an easier life to write more. Jilani Bano again was a no-brainer because her two novels are just absolutely brilliant. Her contribution to three prominent schools of writing, although she doesn't subscribe to any of them. Progressive writing, modernism, of course, as well as something called abstractism in Urdu. These things, I mean, it just made sense to, because I wanted to show a range. At the same time, there are enough convergences in their interests, concerns, their, place and time of being for me to include them in the book.
Cool. So that we can go into the next question. So as you said, no, there are multiple yardsticks that people quote, and that's why some of the writings go into oblivion and all. Leaving aside Jilani Bano, the other two were also very famous in their lifetimes, but were almost forgotten after that, and their writing did not appear anywhere, nor their names appear in any discourses and things like that. But now with your book, they seem to be coming back. In some sense, the translation is also a process of rebirth. It's like they are coming back in a new language, but again they are into discourse now. So how do you see this birth, rebirth cycle, fame, oblivion cycle? So it is kind of going in a loop as a natural cycle, it seems. How do you see, both from a scholar perspective, because you do extensive work on these things, and also as a literary loving person?
Okay, so why is it that they've kind of vanished from after?
Yes, why is that they have vanished, and how this book is sort of bringing it back? So in that sense, how translations and literary criticism can bring back eminent writers from oblivion.
Right, okay. So I think that, yes, all three of these women were, very famous and had the status of celebrities in their time. And we also have to remember that we are talking about a time when radio was the most important medium, right? Most of these writers, progressive writers, either read out their work on radio, or they had someone else do it. So that is the kind of, so people would, I mean, it's difficult for me to kind of conjure the world in which they would have been kind of writing. The kind of the celebrity that they would have enjoyed. Just 1 second, I'm just wondering, are the people here getting, do you want to move your chairs? Would that help? Because I think people are getting drenched over here. Maybe just move your chairs, and there are also some empty chairs over here. The second reason is, of course, that Urdu is something that is, in many literary histories, associated with North India, which is again ironic because it's in the Deccan that Urdu flowers as a literary language and then takes its resources up north through figures like Wali Dakkani, right? So that is one reason that perception still persists today, that Urdu is a northern phenomenon, it's a Pakistani and a North Indian phenomenon. And so as a result of that, you have the writers of the Deccan who've been forgotten, particularly after their time, right? And of course, Hyderabad was a princely state. The colonial narrative was that the princely states were, static, timeless entities where nothing happened, nothing changed. There was no reform, no progress, no social and cultural life, no vibrancy to speak of. And so these are one reasons why in general these writers are neglected, but why they have been forgotten, even I think in Hyderabad to some extent, is because of, I think, the declining fates of Urdu, I think, and the kind of the decline in the quality of literary circles and things like that, right, which are now becoming increasingly rarefied and limited. So so I think that's one reason. There was another part to your question, I forgot what it was.
Yeah, so how do we see this fame oblivion game? Do you see as a scholar or a literature lover, how do you understand this? Is it a natural phenomena that
There is a rise and there is a low, or is it a general negligence or a multitude of factors that contribute to this? Is what I would
don't think it's natural. I think it's history and the way history works. I don't believe in these cyclical ideas of time.
Yeah.
And I think the second part, I just remembered what you were asking. You were asking about how this book contributes to that.
Yes.
See, it was very clear to me very early on that now if you look at the curriculum of Indian writing in English, or women writing, Indian writing in translation, right, or courses in Indian literatures at universities, for instance, or women's writings from India, you will always find, or I hope you will always find, Ismat Chughtai, Khuratul and Haider, you'll find Rashid Jahan. And the reason why we know about them is, ironically, the reason why they make it to all these curricula in India, in North America, is because they've been translated into English. So I wanted to harness the hegemony of English to my own purposes and to find a new readership for my writers. So I think the aim of this book is precisely to that, is precisely to do that, to find new readerships for these writers. Harnessing English, which is the reason why so many of our languages are dying, and make it, twist it to work in some ways, at least, to our purposes, right? So that's a very small, modest attempt on my part to do that.
Yeah. So we'll now move to our favorite topic of translation. Translation is usually seen as a thankless job or a excruciating dilemma within act, which is very, very stressful, or you're always unhappy with what you put out. So there is all this negative narratives that go around translation. But as a translator myself, I would like to say that it is an immensely courageous job to pick up somebody else's work from a different time and era and bring it into a different language, into a different time, and make it accessible. So you have extensively worked on the translation of these three writers, as well as done a lot of research about their work, their lives, right? So what is those things that so to get this sort of courage to translate, you need empathy, and to get that sort of empathy, you need to know the person, the writer, their lives, their conditions, what you have said in the first, as we started this conversation, no? So what are those some of those things about these three writers that made you feel very at home with them, or felt a personal connection with them?
Okay, that's a difficult one. But yes, you're right. I mean, translation is a huge responsibility, and you're always veering between being faithful and being faithless,
yes.
Which is what I think A.K. Ramanujan said about translation, right? That you're constantly. There's also a great Italian saying that my husband, who's a computational linguist, I don't know where he is right now. I think something Italian. He told me about it the other day. It's tradutori traditori, which means translators, traitors. So translators are always traitors. You are always betraying both the source as well as the kind of the target language. You can't be true to either. You cannot forget that you are translating and that you have a responsibility to be faithful to the source. At the same time, you also have to refashion the source, and you can't just kind of create a perfect metaphrase of the source text. The new text will look different. You have to own it. It's as much your creation as it is that of the author of the source, right? So yeah, it's a huge responsibility. I think for me, I think my scholarly practice has, and my training is that you always look at the whole picture. You don't just, take a text in isolation. So I need to know what the writer was like, what their priorities were, if there is any insight that they've given us in any of their writings, or if they're around, can I talk to them and ask them what they were thinking of when they did this? Is there any particular reason why they went for this genre? Couldn't they have made a short story? Why did Zeenat Sajida, for instance, write, why did Jilani Bano choose to write a novel about, about the struggles of Telangana peasants and farmers? So I think I need to get into the skin and the soul of my writers in order to be able to understand what the soul of the text is. So all of this sounds very, very, very esoteric, but I think that it's important for me to get to know the writer, and I think that is where that empathy comes from. If you understand, the context in which they lived and what was important to them and what their joys and their sorrows were, then you can kind of immerse yourself and ensure that the translated text also has the marks of that. I don't know to what extent I've been successful with that, but that was my aim at least.
Yes, and in this book it comes out even more beautifully, because soon after the translation there is your notes and analysis of the text and the rest of the text, no? So one would understand like how much empathy you are showing and where it is coming from. In that literary analysis, that thing is coming out very clearly. Otherwise, in a translated piece, you could say, okay, she has done the way she has done, but in here it has come out well. Okay, so one more a bit tricky and difficult question. Especially with Nazia Akhtar's biography and the kind of analysis you did, you have emphasized on her grieving process, on her mental health, and you have touched that aspect in all the three writers wherever possible. Could you explain a bit more on why you felt doing that? Because whatever was there, it was not in her writing, available in her writing directly. You had to go to her daughter's writing and pick it up and try up the strings and things like that. So it is a bit more extensive labor that you have put in. Could you explain about why you felt like that and how did you go about it?
Okay, so I think let me start with a little bit of context for people who haven't read the book yet. Nazia Akhtar, who is one of the writers I talk about in this book, had a very tragic life. So she was happily married to a man she fell in love with. She had 2 children with him. It was a very idyllic life. That's when she did a lot of her writing. They lived in these charmed small towns all over Telangana and Andhra. And then he died. He just all of a sudden had a heart attack, keeled over, and was dead. The shock of that, and at this time they had, both their daughters were really young, and the shock of that sent her, she went into deep mental shock for about 2 years, and she couldn't, in that period she didn't recognize her children, and the trauma of that, this whole experience is something which her daughter Huma Kidwai writes in her own novel, The Hosseini Alam House. This is a novel in English, and so she writes about that whole period of grief and what her mother went through mentally. She needed mental health support and had to be looked after. And after that she married someone else. There was a lot of pressure to get married. again, right? Because what will happen to your future? How will you support yourself and things like that? And it was not a happy marriage. I mean, she tried to make it work, and for 15 years she lived apart from those little girls, right? She didn't want that, they didn't want that, but that had to be how that marriage would work. So, so this was again part of that, how can you not take such a huge thing into account when you are writing about a writer, right? So I mean, so your question was it about empathy or no? So it was about
like what did your thought process to go
right.
about this and
Yeah.
and get it. So you are close to that.
Right. So my aim was, I thought that was a very important break, a very important tipping point in Najma Nikhat's life. It was important that that I understand it fully, and that I take that into account while while writing this book and while translating her work. And yeah, I think the Najma Nikhat that you see after that and the Najma Nikhat that she was before that, because this whole period also meant a break of almost 2 decades from her literary life. I mean, she was a regular at literary gatherings in Hyderabad and things like that. She was writing, she was prolific, but for about 15-20 years she didn't write any short stories. She remained a prolific diarist at this time, which is really interesting. I mean, there are several diaries from the 60s and the late 60s, mostly the 70s, that she keeps in fine, minute Urdu print, which is impossible to read. It's so difficult to read it. And and she maintained these diaries, these everyday accounts of life, but there wasn't any fiction happening. So this is again, in a writer's life, these are different stages, right? And the personal always will contribute to will affect the creative in this way, and vice versa also, I think. So yeah, I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, totally. And while on that point, I will take up the next question of these writers at that time doing their domestic chores as well as handling the creative work that they were doing. And in this book and also in your recent scroll article about Fatima Alam Ali, you write about the grocery list and the creative expression short stories or poetry, whatever, coexisting on the same page and in handwritten notes, in the sense that Bibi's room or Virginia's room for oneself is asking for a dedicated physical space, and these writers were not even getting a book completely to themselves. They were kind of using the same thing in many ways. Maybe they are like working and in the kitchen, and suddenly there is a rush of creative juices and they have noted it down. So you have explored this aspect in the book, and also I think in your Instagram and elsewhere also you have posted those snippets and shows. So how was your journey about exploring these things? And this is the only human touch of those writers, right? Like the handwritten notes. So how was it? And even how was your experience reading that Urdu?
Right. So I think again, I think a little bit of context is needed. The scroll article that Purnima is talking about came out as one of the 6 articles that New India Foundation Fellows were invited to write on the occasion of the India at 75. Right. So it came out on, I think, the 16th of August, and I wrote in that about women's hisab ki kitabein. So. Books in which expense books. Hisab ki kitab is an expense book, right? And what you find in these hisab ki kitabein, right, that I was able to access, I was looking at, I had the opportunity to look at Fatima Alam Ali's hisab ki kitabein. There were so many of them, and her daughter gave me access to them. To take a look at them. And what I was very struck by is that Fatima Alam Ali's Hisab ki Kitab would consist of her grocery lists, her expenses for the month, things like that. Somewhere an idea for a short story or an essay would be written down. somewhere, there would be page after page where she's, rehearsing the title of an essay. It's been written and then struck out several times in different combinations of words and, shifting this word around, deleting this word, removing this. So ideas for essays you would find. Then you would find list of books that she wanted to buy by writers who were friends or whom she looked up to. On one page you found just a single date with a pen which still works, which was kept in the middle of that book. Okay? And that date is not significant to, it wouldn't make sense to any of us, but it made sense to Asma, Fatima Alam Ali's daughter, because it was the day that Fatima Alam Ali's husband had died. So, so it was, so there are, the point I'm trying to make is that there are multiple registers and there are so many different things happening in a hisab ki kitab kept by a woman, right? I think this is a demonstration of, again, a gendered life, the kind of lives that women lead, right? When you are a full-time professional, when you are a writer, and you are a full-time homemaker, you cook, you look after your children, you are responsible for, you look after all your family members, you have to look after your partner, you have to look after everyone. So the clutter and the different registers at which these writings spoke were, I think, demonstrative of the kind of lives that women live and the conditions in which they write. So, and Zinat Sajida also talks about this in a very memorable essay called Hum Hai To Abhi Raah Mein Hai Sangi Gira Aur. As long as we exist, there will be obstacles in our path. Where she's writing precisely about the mental load that women, as homemakers who care for their families, who cook, who do all these other things, have professional careers and are also trying to write, how they manage to find the time to write. Right? So, I think I think that was the gist of that, yeah.
So in the book you have extensively, as I said, apart from these three writers, Hyderabad also, the bygone era Hyderabad also comes a lot. Can you please elaborate on the mulki, gair mulki part that is there in this book, which I found very fascinating, and new generation Hyderabadis would love to hear from you.
Okay, so just a show of hands, I'm just going to try and see. Does anyone know what the mulki, gair mulki aspect of identity is? Show of hands, does anyone know? Okay, there are, I think a few people who know. I think, yes, for the younger people in particular, we should point out. So the mulki, gair mulki aspect is this. So for about 150 years, there are different waves of people who migrate to Hyderabad. Well, much before that, Hyderabad was, the Deccan region was always very cosmopolitan for almost a millennium, let's say, right? And people always came here because this was a prosperous land. The rulers were relatively benign, followed a generally pluralist ethos. It was a very it was a good place to migrate and work to. Just as today we search for greener pastures abroad, the Deccan used to be an important place for that. So a lot of artists, scientists, statesmen would come here. But over the past 150 years, I would say from about 1850 onwards till about the end of the princely Hyderabad state, there was a specific impetus and a specific emphasis on getting these skilled people, right, from North India or from other parts of, even the South and even elsewhere, right, to come and settle here and work in the bureaucracy, work in the areas of education, for instance, and revenue and all of that. So as a result of this, the people who came were very condescendingly labeled by, the nobles of Hyderabad as ghair mulki, right? So these are outsiders, but over a period of time, these ghair mulkis also became mulki, formally through, gestures that were made by the Hyderabad state, like a sadaqat nama that was given, which was a certificate that asserted a kind of citizenship. Or naturally as well. I mean, they married people who were from the Deccan, they settled here, they lived here. So for me, the reason why this was really important, right, talking about the mulki, ghair mulki question in this book is, what is a Hyderabadi woman, right? So this is a book about Hyderabadi women. So who is a Hyderabadi woman? I mean, is it what what sort of roots or identity or cultural markers are we looking for when we talk about Hyderabadi women? Is it language? Is it how long you've been here? Is it is it class or caste or religion? Is it nationality? Because I think some of the British and French women who married and who settled here and who became a part of Hyderabadi public life can also be considered Hyderabadi, right? So so I mean this whole question I think came from that. So I had to trace the history of what was the mulki, ghair mulki, identity aspect. And the mulki, ghair mulki aspect takes on different colors during the transfer of power when there's, when there are attempts by people who want to use that to unite Hyderabad and Hyderabadis. And there are people who use that as a way to divide Hyderabad and Hyderabadis. Later on it comes to be used in a very pejorative and negative sense against Andhra migrants. So this, there's a long history of this debate. And for this book, this was important because we have to talk about, I had to define the terrain of what I mean when I say a Hyderabadi woman, right?
You have spoken at length here, and also in this book you have written extensively about the multiple invisibilities of women writers, especially from Hyderabad. So this is a great start to that conversation, to undo those invisibilities. But as community of literature lovers, do you have any suggestions apart from buying, reading, reviewing, and those discussing these books? Do you see any other ways and means, either by individuals or government organizations or academic institutions, to reduce these invisibilities? Your thoughts, please.
So I think government we can give up on where Urdu is concerned. It doesn't really, there isn't much that's going to, if you look at the state of Awane Urdu and places like that which should be preserved. People are the hope. I mean, there are people who showed up here despite the torrential rains that we have and Visarjan related traffic restrictions, all of that. So I think reading, discussions, right? We have to keep these authors in circulation. We have to read them and we have to talk about them. I have also found that social media seems to be a place where Urdu is doing really well, right? Yeah. Where a lot of, I mean, you have specific pages that are dedicated to literatures and languages of the subcontinent, and I find that there are some very robust and stimulating discussions that you can have there. I mean, social media can be, don't get me wrong, it can be a very toxic place.
Yes.
But I think it's also a very empowering place, and for me, for instance, it has given me, a platform from where I can talk about these writers, and I find that a lot of young people, some of them are here today, a lot of young people have, become interested in these writers and, are, talking about these, about these writers and these languages and their literary traditions, which is very encouraging for me to say. And I mean, it's very, it's great to have this medium through which you can, interact. And I mean, that's how we were connected originally as well, right? So there are so many things like that. I think there's hope.
So in terms of social media, okay. So yeah, I think at least 4 or 5 years into this book, or 2, 3.
I would say actively writing and researching it about 3 years. Okay. But I mean, I first started thinking about it and kind of forming some idea of what I wanted to do with this in 2015. So yeah, 2017 to 2020 is when I wrote it.
So to put out a book like this, one needs tremendous strength and stamina. So what is your secret of energy? Don't tell me Nutella.
Right, so Nutella is, I have a long and complicated relationship with Nutella. We don't see a lot of each other these days, but it's still an important part of my life. So I mean, I found that working consistently, and I think we are different in this sense, even when it comes to generation, I find that younger people, for instance, my students, for instance, find it difficult to understand how this works. But I find that working consistently, even if you read or write half an hour a day, and literally there are days when that's all I can do, if that, even that feels like a luxury, right? I think working consistently has helped, and that always helps me to get things done. Otherwise it's impossible. I cannot devote 6 months exclusively to a particular project or with other things. So so I think working consistently and a lot of coffee, occasional Nutella helps.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for indulging me and patiently answering. Now we will open up for the audience to ask any questions.
Or before we hand it over to the audience, there is a quick announcement that the book is for sale back there, and the author is here, so you can get your copy signed after the event is concluded. So, any quick, comments, suggestions, thoughts?
So, thank you for coming here today, and the discussion was good. So, I want to ask, can you name some other writers other than the 3 that you mentioned in the book, which are also worth reading?
Oh, there are so many. This is a tough one. But yes, so Wajida Tabassum, I assume you're asking about women writers, right? Wajida Tabassum definitely, although I think that would also be a somewhat controversial opinion in some parts of Hyderabad, because she wrote about things that a lot of people were not comfortable with. She wrote about female sexuality, she wrote about caste and caste patriarchy. Sughra Humayun Mirza is someone whom we really need to recognize. She's my next, apart from the translations, she's my next project. Sughra Humayun Mirza was a traveler, a reformer, a writer, a journalist. She started, a literary magazine. She traveled over large parts of Asia and Europe. Purnima has translated a story by her into Telugu, right? Is it Bibi Turi Kaha?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's that one. So she's someone. There's Tayyaba Bilgrami, there's Nasima Turabul Hassan, there is Fatima Alam Ali, there's Rafia Manzoorul Amin, whose novels were very successful and have also been converted into a very old Doordarshan serial which still remains popular and it still has fans. So I mean the list is, I can give you a very long list. There are a lot of writers, and luckily through things like Rekhta, even out of print books have are there, so you can access a lot of these writers over there.
I just wanted to ask you, I'm here. Did you happen to go through some of the articles that were published in the Urdu newspapers? Because women also contributed a lot in the Sunday editions of the literary magazines that used to come. And there was also a lot of humor that they had. There was one woman, I think she's migrated, called Ali. I don't know the first name, I'm just trying to recollect.
Right, so a lot of, I think most of Zinat Sajida's literary essays came out in Siyasat and a couple of other places. Fatima Alam Ali, I know, wrote for Siyasat, right? Avdesh Rani Baba, who doesn't write humor but writes, she writes humor as well, but she has a regular column that comes out every Thursday in Munsif. So I think she is also someone who's, important to understand and read. Her work has involved journalism mostly. So yeah, definitely. Thank you for coming, Najib.
Tremendous work, and we are here to read your book. So, you probably are aware of Mahfil Khawateen.
Ji.
And are there any good women writers? That's where they are encouraging a lot of young women writers to come out. So, are there any promising ones which you would like to mention?
I've been so busy with this particular book and the research behind this that I haven't actually had the opportunity to think about the current, to really formulate my thoughts about that. So I wouldn't like to kind of make any premature remarks about that. But yes, Mahfil Khawateen is a very important institution. So it's been around, for anyone who wants to know, since the 1970s. 1971, I think, is when Mahfil Khawateen was formed. They have regular meetings, so every month, I think only briefly during the pandemic were they kind of interrupted, and even then they seem to have transitioned very easily to things like Zoom and all that. They managed for some time at least. They meet every month, and they meet to discuss their writings, to present their writings and their analysis of each other's work and so on. I know that among the senior writers, for instance, your mother Nasima Turabul Hassan was prominent there, and then so I think until recently Avdesh Rani Baba has also been there and kind of been performing and presenting her work. Jamila Nishat also was, I think, for some time attending. I don't remember if, but among the younger crop, I'm yet to form any solid opinions to present to you today.
Hello. So you talked at length, and Purnima asked you about the rediscovery of authors that seem to vanish, even though they're like fairly prominent during their own time. And I'm wondering about like a culture where women's writings are not taken seriously enough by their own people. And how did you find like any difficulty when you're going back to all of these writings and you're trying to like begin that process of rediscovery? Do you find that there is a cultural reluctance to identify women as writers first, like as as literary icons? Do you think that the culture like allows that sort of an acceptance to come forth for that rediscovery to happen? Is do families create space, do communities create that sort of space?
Right. I think that's a great and a very pertinent question. Yes, I think I did come across this in not only at the level of the family but also the level of the community or the city, right? So, for instance, I mean, as much as Hyderabadis have supported this book through the process of its research so enthusiastically. I mean, the families of the three writers, and here I have to acknowledge Farhan Saab as well. Again, I don't know where he is, but Farhan Saab and his help in, for instance, with whether it is the permissions for translating his mother's writings, meeting Jilani Bano. I met her years and years ago. Sajjad Sahab for assistance with Zinat Sajida's work, Huma, right, for assistance with her own mother Najma Nikhat's work. And other Hyderabadis as well, who enthusiastically, who freely gave of their time and said, come and meet me, and we'll talk about this. I mean, this book would not have happened without them. At the same time, there were people who would tell me, oh, wo to wahiyat likhti hai. So Wajida Tabassum wahiyat likhti hai. Because she writes about things that are uncomfortable, right? For a lot of men in particular, right? You don't want those things to be pointed out. So someone else, as I said, told me that Najma Nikhat is a minor writer, and they kept discouraging me, don't work on her. So, so much of that is about, a kind of willful neglect of these women, right? Habib Zia, who is a humorist and a scholar and a writer, writes about, she produced this anthology of Hyderabadi women's humorous writings, right? And there are some 20-25 writers in that so clearly, I mean, this is not a recent thing. This has been going on for a long time. Women have been producing humorous prose for a very long time. She writes how Mujtaba Hussain, who's known and who will have a lot of fans here as well, and I'm also a fan. Mujtaba Hussain was the leading humorist of Hyderabad. He was well known outside Hyderabadi circles as well. He once said, that if these women, write humor in such large numbers, what are men supposed to do? Mop, sweep floors, cook? He said that. So, I mean, I think that there is definitely, Hyderabad has had a history of institutions and individuals supporting actively. So, for instance, women's humor was also supported by different institutions which encouraged, and by publications like Siyasat and like others, which kind of came forward and said, we'll have a regular column by a woman who's going to write, or we'll do this, or you write and we'll publish. But at the same time, Hyderabad is also a part of the world, and the world is patriarchal. So yes, there are layers of this that you see at the level of the family. So one reason why I couldn't, and I talk about this, one reason why I could not work on Waja Tabassum was that I could not, the main reason why I couldn't is because I could absolutely not find, wasn't able to access, her family. And you need permissions in order to be able to translate and print someone's work. So family plays a very important role in your afterlife, whether you're going to be remembered or forgotten, right? And has a particular significance for, a woman writer who's in any case, seen as controversial. So I hope I've answered your question to some extent.
Yes, you did.
Good evening, ma'am. What I want to ask you is, how did you get the idea of writing this book? Like, what was the main source of it? From where? Any inspiration? I'd really love to know about it.
Thank you for asking that. So this takes me back several years. So when I was doing the research for my doctoral dissertation, I was working on the transfer of power in Hyderabad. I came to Hyderabad, right, for my archival visit and for, to meet people and to understand what had happened, if they had any ideas about books I should read or people I should meet, just to get a sense and a feel and a pulse of the place. That's when I met Sajjad Shahid. And in the book, for instance, I talk about how every story has a beginning and some stories have many beginnings, right? So this book is also a story. It has one beginning. It has many beginnings. One of the most important beginnings and one of the biggest influences and formative influences for me has been Sajjad Shahid, who's not here today because he's out of town. I was working on a totally different topic, but Sajjad Saab said that, you might have liked meeting my mother because she was a writer and she wrote this essay called Agar Allah Mein Aurat Hote. So, like a hound to the scent, I was like, no, this is something that I must hold on to. Over a period of time, so he gave me this book. Huma came to speak about her mother's, about her own work in a course that I was teaching at TIS Hyderabad. And she brought her mother's work. And of course I knew about Jilani Bano's work, I knew about Waja Tabassum's work, but it began to dawn on me slowly that this is big. This is not just a couple of women who were, outliers, who were writing, who were very talented, who were very successful. There is a bigger tradition of writing here. And the more I looked, the more I realized that this tradition goes back 150 years. We don't know anything about it. A novel of Jilani Bano's has been translated, another one has been translated with limited success. Some of her short stories have been translated. Waja Tabassum, until Rima Abbasi's translation just came out, right, and of several stories. Clearly she was able to, make those connections that I was unable to. Until all of this happened, there were just a couple of things here and there. So I began to, the more I looked, I was like, no, we really need to read these writers because they're writing about very important things that are important for our time, things that were important in their time. And, clearly this idea that a princely state had nothing really going on, socially, culturally, wasn't a dynamic, is totally wrong. Look at all these dynamic women saying all these dynamic things, these very interesting, fascinating, important, radical things, and why don't we know about them? We don't know about them because they're in Urdu. No one reads Urdu anymore, right? Unfortunately. So I think from there I was like, I have to. So it was also easy leaving transfer of power behind because that's also a very difficult topic to work on. So I said, let's leave that aside and work on this first. Thank you.
Hi ma'am. This is more a question of method and form as such. So when you're writing a book such as this, where the material that you're drawing on, archival material, is via interviews, letters, diary entries, grocery lists, is it difficult for you to, draw on a single identity of the person that you're writing about? Because you're getting ideas of the person from your family, from maybe letters about the person, and it's not just about your book but also about women as such represented in the 19th century. and how their lives haven't really come to us via just autobiographies. For example, if you look at, say, the first Indian doctor, so to say, Anandibai Joshi. There was a book recently by Kavita Rao called Lady Doctors, where she traces out the life of the person, but there's very little autobiographical narratives that come to us, right? So it's all letters that her husband wrote about her, or only those letters that the husband would give to the media as such to read. So when you look at all of these different identities, it's a pastiche. So which identity stands out? How do you, as somebody who's writing about these lives, decide on which identity is going to take the forefront?
Okay, so yes, you're right. I mean, there are, how do you filter the source, and how do you filter the archive? What do you do with that, right? I was very fortunate because Najma Nikhat, for instance, wrote an essay about her family and about herself, and she saw herself, interestingly, and I do talk about this, very differently from the way her daughter saw her. Her daughter saw her as a victim, ultimately as a survivor, but as someone who was such a tragic figure, right? She saw her as someone who had been through a very unfair life, and society had been very unfair to her, individuals had been very unfair to her. But the essay, when you read Mera Ghar by Najma Nikhat, she sees herself as a triumphant matriarch, surveying her dominions, surveying the house and everyone who lives in it, talking about her relationships with them. Some of those relationships are difficult, some of those relationships are good. What is her sense of history? What is her sense of legacy? All of those things. Jilani Bano as well, I was very fortunate, as I said. She wrote a wonderful essay in 1964 in a magazine called Nukush about her life until then, right? And she writes very kind of, very eloquently about her vibrant childhood and, making the most of limited resources, how creative they were as children. She writes very touchingly about the loss of her firstborn, about her firstborn child, about her firstborn son. And she also went on to write a book called Main Kaun Hoon, which came out in 2010. So there's this whole, there's a gap between these two. But I had these two really valuable autobiographical sources. But as you said, I mean, there were many other things, right? So there were, for instance, in the case of Zinat Sajida, what I had to rely on were an unpublished short biography that was written by her son, things that were written, by her students, things that were written by her friends about her, commemorating her, people who knew her really well. There were also, yes, I also conducted interviews with her son, right? And these were semi-structured interviews, if that's of any interest to you. So I would go with a few questions, and I would kind of then let the conversation take its own, turn, and see if there was something which I had not thought of or considered which came out in those conversations. But yes, I did have to juggle with this. I did have to see what is an opinion that a family member has and what I have to be careful with. So questions like, women discarding the veil or holding on to the veil, there are reasons for doing that. So there was a lot of weighing and juxtaposing different sources to see what made sense, right? Because my aim always was that how would these women want themselves to be represented? So for instance, until I had unearthed this, autobiographical article that Jilani Bano had written about the loss of her, firstborn, which was very traumatic and which affected her for years, I was not sure if I wanted to write about it. It was like, and I was not in a position to ask her because she has various health problems and things like that. I had one interview with her and I had not asked her that question because the conversation kind of took another turn and we could never come to it. You know how, if you're a researcher, you would know how that process works, right? You go in with a plan and it all goes to hell. So for a long time I debated about whether or not I should write about Sameem, this child that she lost, right? Because to me, I did not want to, prey on, or to have this voyeuristic gaze of mine and the readers into a subject that she may not want to talk about, right? But then when I found this source and she's talking about it and talking about what it meant to her, it made sense to include that. So my instinct has always been to be true to the writers and how they would like to be remembered by history. And doing that always involves looking at, different sources together, corroborating what you find there, and deciding. Then you take a call. As and again, as I said, that my practice is immersive. So my priorities are different, right? So I have to make sure that I'm true to my writers and that I'm, not betraying them in any way, for lack of a, better term. So yeah, so you have to. It's not. There isn't a single, method that I can tell you for this. You just have to be. You have to use the best of your historian's training and look at different sources together to see the picture that emerges. And then, as a feminist scholar, you have to decide what is in the interests of the women you are writing about. Right? I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Yeah, very quickly, I just wanted to ask you about a methodological question. Just wanted to know, how do you zero down to these authors? Is there a theme that runs into your mind? Because they are covering varied areas and a lot of other underpinnings. So how do you come to these authors? And you're also working on some of them, right? That's one. The other comment that I have, a lot of women writers also used to write when there were plethora of magazines used to come. May not be from Hyderabad, but like Shama, Beastly Sadi, you have a lot of them are coming from it. Pakistan. So it was also like a
Giving liberty to women to write about their problems, everything, right from this household things to Ghareelu nuske and all those things. So that has also stopped the younger women writers to explore, because these magazines and publications, they were shut.
I think some of them are still running. I think they suffered a lot during the pandemic because circulation and distribution systems kind of broke down. But okay, so your first question, how did I and why did I work on these writers? So I think I partly answered that when Purnima asked me that question. But yeah, so my aim was, one, to showcase the diversity of their concerns and the forms in which they write. And so, these writers were different enough, to be put into one book to show a range of Hyderabadi women's writings. And at the same time, there are elements that are common and that run through. So a rootedness in Hyderabad, which comes differently, right? So each writer relates to Hyderabad and writes about Hyderabad differently, right? They may not literally write essays about Hyderabad, but life, culture, society, politics, and the history of Hyderabad come in interesting ways. There are other convergences when it comes to things like marriage and motherhood, politics, which is really important because both Nazia Akhtar and Zinat Sajida were progressive writers. They identified as progressive writers, and one of my aims was also to look at the Progressive Writers Association in Hyderabad, particularly women writers who've been neglected. We always talk about that the progressive writers movement ended in the early 1950s. Just because these great men stopped writing doesn't mean that everyone stopped writing. There's a long tradition. Nazia Akhtar was an avowed progressive till the day she died. So till I think she was the president of the Hyderabad Progressive Writers Association of Women's of Urdu writers in the 1980s, and again handling various responsibilities in the 1990s. Jilani Banu was very interesting when it came to this political aspect, or even the literary aspect, because she is consistently refused to identify with, no, I'm not a progressive, I'm not a modernist, I'm not any of these. She's refused all these labels. I'm not a feminist. She's refused all of these labels. So, yeah, so I think my aim was also that, in spite of saying that, I think one of the most robust representations of the progressive writers in Jilani Banu's work can be seen in Jilani Banu's work, and progressive concerns. So for instance, I think she's written, the finest novel on, on the Telangana peasantry and what they went through, the Telangana struggle and the lives of the Telangana peasantry, is Jilani Banu's Barishe Sangh. I think it's, I think it tops most other, Krishan Chandar is known for his book, for his novella Jab Khet Jage. But I think this book needs a lot more recognition. So I think the political aspect was important, and then that is something that ran in different ways. So again, you could show a range, of people who had these shared concerns, but in different ways, manifested them in different ways, and of course other aspects to their life that were interesting.
Why is it protesting so much? Okay, thank you Nazia and thank you Purnima. Can you all hear me? Okay, so I just want to say a few things and maybe leave everyone, including Nazia and Purnima, with a bit of a provocation. If any of you have seen the poster for this event, the hosts are Lamakan and Hyderabad Urban Lab. We used to have this ritual earlier. After the lockdown, we kind of lost it, which is that every event here would start with some kind of an invocation to the values that Lamakan stands for. And I think it's really important for us to do it at this point of time once again, which is that Lamakan was set up primarily to foster open cultural activities, right? Some kind of a progressive cultural politics. We don't know what that means. We know how to recognize what is not open or what is going against openness. So we do have actually gatekeepers whose work is at a minimum to make sure that things that run contrary to the idea of openness do not make it in. Right? That's one thing we always do. When we have had, Naeem would remember, very long debates, very involved debates here on what does it mean to be open, what does it mean to be liberal, because ideas of liberalism are very, very contested. They can be very, very reactionary and very, very conservative at certain points of time, but they can also open up really radical possibilities at other points of time. So that's what we have always attempted to do. But why is Hyderabad Urban Lab involved in this? Especially because last month we did another discussion on this book online, and that was done through another organization or a network called Khidki, which is also very closely associated with Hyderabad Urban Lab. And here, in this particular case, we did not use the name Khidki, we called it Hyderabad Urban Lab, and I just want to explain that politics a little bit. So Hyderabad Urban Lab was essentially set up 10 years ago, shortly after Lamakan was set up, and the idea was that there are ways in which we need to think about places, cities particularly, in a way that is very deeply embedded in that particular city. Because there are ways in which we can do urban theory, we can predict the futures of cities across the world without ever having lived in them. And we wanted to counter that. Which is basically, sometimes we call it Chicago School of Sociology, sometimes we call it something else. But essentially what we are saying is that for you to understand what happens in places, you've got to be embedded in them. You really have to get into the skin of places. Now, what does it mean to get yourself into the skin of Hyderabad? One of the first things that you will realize is that Hyderabad was never fully colonized by the British. Right? Hyderabad never became independent on the same day on which India became independent. It took a whole year for it to properly become part of India. Right? And that means that the arc of modernization, arc of modernity in Hyderabad is somehow different from that of the rest of the country, or what the rest of the country claims to be the arc of its modernity. And I'm saying that very specifically because about a year and a half ago, when we started these kinds of conversations about what does it mean to be modern, what does it mean to be Hyderabadi, what does it mean to feel that being Hyderabadi means that you are somehow, somewhere lagging behind the rest of India's modernity, right? So you have Raja Ravi Verma being the starting point of Indian artistic modernity, but Hyderabad's artistic modernity doesn't start until 1950s. Right? Even though Hyderabad actually invested huge amounts of money and resources recovering Ajanta and Ellora in the 1920s. That entire history of Hyderabad's investment in art was lost. It was lost at one particular moment, and that moment is something that we still haven't understood in any meaningful way. We still don't know why it is that 1947 to 1948 is a period around which we have very little creative writing. We have very little short stories, we have very little fiction, we have very little critical writing, we have a lot of pain. We have a lot of people suffering about it. I have met elderly people in the US who would almost literally go into a frenzied rant when they begin to talk about 1947-48, right? But nothing particularly meaningful can emerge from that, and we don't know how to do this, right? Part of what we wanted to do sometime in April, May last year was to try and see if there is a way in which we can begin to think about going beyond the city of Hyderabad, if we can begin to think about regions as somehow having some kind of a salience, some kind of a meaning that is prior to or at least coexisting with the nation state. And that seemed like a very important political and intellectual and cultural project for us, because the Deccan at this point of time is incapable of ever making any kind of state and territorial claims. Right? The Deccan cannot become a state. It cannot actually, you cannot have political parties fighting about the Deccan at all. And that precisely is why it is possible for the Deccan to actually open up all kinds of ways in which creative imaginations can begin to operate. Right? And I'm saying this because not just the Deccan, but this can happen around Malabar, this can happen around Bundelkhand, this can happen all around India. Every single place that you go to will have these repositories, will have these archives, will have these histories that can actually make it possible for us to imagine ourselves as human beings that belong in so many parallel realms, which is so important for us, because the moment you're locked into this situation where you have to make a choice about whether or not you're Indian in a particularly narrow framework, you're stuck. Right? You want to get out of it. And that's the reason why we began to have these conversations about how to think about our own histories, our own people, our own stories, and so on and so forth. And part of that, right? I mean, I'm actually a social scientist. I make maps, I study maps, I study cities, I study city economies, I study governance systems. But a part of what I do is also about trying to figure out how to build archives. Archives of contemporary history, archives of the last 40 years, right? How do you put together archives of stories of the entire queer community, right? You have people who have committed suicide, and you have their letters, and you don't know what to whom to attribute them to, right? Can the family let you use it? Not. What happens when you have a person who has changed their gender, and then you have all of their material? Does the new person own what belonged to the earlier person or not? Right? So a legal question, there are cultural questions, political questions, struggle with all of this. One of the most important questions that keeps coming back to me, as someone who is involved in these politics of archives, is that an archive is to create a catalogue, right? And that catalogue is exactly what Edward Said talks about when he invokes Gramsci's work. He says that history always leaves an infinity of traces in each of it, but it doesn't give you a catalogue. And the task of critical elaboration, therefore, is to compile that. Right? And I think that these conversations are very important for us at the urban, at the regional, all of these different scales, precisely because they help us reconfigure our catalogs. Right? We're compiling and recompiling our catalogs so that we can make better sense of our lives. Now the question, the provocation for you, with which I'm going to end this, is that I really don't believe that this is about women writing in Urdu language alone. My grandmother in 1951 wrote an essay in which the title was, "Are you addressing me?" Right? The title was "Nanne Na Anand." Right? That's exactly what taxi driver would say, right? That's exactly what sounds so much like one of the titles of this work. It's a question of women at a certain point of time trying to figure out who they are and locating themselves in a very, very complex field. My grandmother came into Hyderabad when she was 11 years old as a married woman, and she was all over every single political event of that period. She was walking around the city. She was the one who taught me how to think about the city. Right? So there were women who were doing this every day. And there were men who were doing this every day. And I think that sometimes, very casually I keep thinking that what stands for Hyderabad is Zinda Talisman because it comes to you in so many languages, right? Ek parchi mein aapko Marathi, Kannada, Telugu, Urdu, right? And I think that that's what we are. We are people who constantly exist in these multiple language spaces, and we need to reinvent that, right? And that reinvention of ourselves means that we need to think about these issues not merely as Urdu and women and Hyderabad, but as representative of so many other things that are getting connected and reconnected in all sorts of ways, right? So that's what I really want to hear you reflect a little bit on, and then we can close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand, for that. That made a lot of sense. It's given me new ways of thinking about this. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm thinking of this even from the perspective of a comparatist. Right? Something that comparatists always say is that languages are like trees. They grow around each other and they're codependent. Right? So if you're thinking of identity, whether it's regional identity, whether it's even questions of ontology, just being, right? This kind of intergrowing and interconnected, it's impossible to ignore this kind of interconnected web of whether you want to think of it in terms of social and political and regional identity or just ontological, an ontological state of being. So I think I agree with you, because I think if it weren't for, the other parts of her, right? If it weren't for, the Telugu that was in Zinat Sajida, right, which she trained in, if it weren't for the Dakhani, and she doesn't write in Dakhani, she writes in standard Urdu for reasons that I've explained in the book. The other Zinats, if I can say, or the other Hyderabad's, the other parts of Hyderabad that were in her, without that, I think this part would also not be there, right? The oeuvre that she produced, right? Just as to understand Urdu, we also need to understand Punjabi, and we also need to understand Gujarati, and we also need to understand those regional, articulations. I think in the Deccan, of course, this applies in terms of language, in terms of the city, right? You can think of, I'm trying to think of a metaphor that would be as useful and as eloquent as yours, borrowing from Gramsci, right, in terms of catalogue. I think we can also think of it as a palimpsest. Although palimpsest is linear kind of in time, but that could also be one way of looking at it. I think I completely agree with you, and I would like for someone to take on, this kind of work as the next stage of, let's say, a Hyderabadi discourse of writing, if not, this very niche Hyderabadi women's discourse in Urdu. Because I think the larger picture is that. The larger picture is the region and the city, in terms of the city and the various cities within the city, right, which are interconnected and which have grown together, growing around that. As far as the tradition, of specific languages and literary traditions, I think, yes, I completely agree with you. I think because also the historical trajectory, in spite of, this divide between princely states and, modernization happening differently and, British India, certain, I think, points in history are quite similar. So the reform movement, for instance, right? That's why you see, I think if we start looking at Punjabi women's writings, or we start looking at, in Punjabi, or if we start looking at, I know scholars, I know that Amina Tehsil, for instance, is trying to do something similar, what I have done for Hyderabadi women's writings in Urdu, in the case of Bihar. So Bihari women's writings in Urdu, if we start looking at other languages, and in the same kind of, to develop a discourse. I understand what you're saying about a comparative discourse that takes all of these things into account simultaneously. But even if you start looking at individual traditions, you will find that goes back at least 150 years. So I don't know if I've captured everything, but that's right. Yeah.
I think the really important thing for me is this realization that none of us is really Indian enough, right? None of us can be. One of the most important things that we realized when we had that conversation about art and modernity was that Raja Ravi Verma is not modern enough for India. None of us is. And I think it's really important for us to remember that we have all regions have been pushed into that corner where you don't feel good enough. And that's what we really need to value.
So we have come to the end of this very lovely conversation. I just can't thank enough on behalf of Lamakan and also HL, Nazia Akhtar. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, the author of the evening, Nazia Akhtar. And I just can't thank enough to Purnima for conducting this conversation so eloquently. Thank you so much for coming. And also to the audience during this, downpour, despite the rains, you're all here. Thank you so very much indeed. And have a good night. Before we, call it a night, you're most welcome to join us for high tea and samosa. The book is also available just beside these chai and samosa table. Please do not forget to pick up the copy, and the author is all the more happy to sign up the copy. Thank you, and once again, we look forward to your company again. Thank you.